What's left when a currency completely dies? Picture the exact moment a currency stops working. Not declining. Not weakening. Actually dying. The moment when handing someone a stack of your national banknotes gets you the same response as handing them a stack of blank paper. It has happened more times in the last 100 years than most people realize, in wealthy countries and poor ones, in wartime and in peace, and every single time, it forces the same brutal question onto millions of ordinary people at once. If the money is gone, what's actually left? The answer turns out to be remarkably consistent, no matter the country, the decade, or the political system. And once you see the pattern, you start to understand something most people never think about until it's far too late to prepare for it. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Germany, 1923. The currency that became wallpaper. Start with the case most people have at least heard of, because it produced the single most famous image of currency collapse in modern history. Germans burning stacks of banknotes for warmth, because the paper was worth less than the firewood it was replacing. By late 1923, the German mark had entered a death spiral so extreme that prices were doubling every few days. A cup of coffee that cost 5,000 marks in the morning might cost 8,000 marks by the time you finished drinking it. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, because waiting until evening meant their wages had already lost meaningful value. People famously used wheelbarrows to carry enough cash to buy groceries, not as some exaggerated anecdote, but as an ordinary logistical necessity. Here's what actually happened underneath the chaos, the part that matters more than the wheelbarrow photographs. The moment paper money stopped functioning as a reliable store of value, ordinary Germans didn't simply give up on exchange. They shifted, almost overnight, to whatever still held value. Cigarettes became an informal currency in many transactions, because they were durable, divisible, and universally wanted. Foreign currency, especially American dollars, was hoarded fiercely by anyone who could get it, because it kept its purchasing power while the mark evaporated. And real, physical assets, land, tools, machinery, a well-stocked pantry, suddenly became far more valuable than any amount of cash sitting in a bank account. The people who came through 1923 relatively intact weren't the ones with the largest pile of marks. They were the ones who had already converted their wealth into something the collapse couldn't touch. Hungary, 1946. The worst currency collapse ever recorded. If Weimar Germany is the most famous hyperinflation, it isn't even the worst one. That distinction belongs to Hungary, in the aftermath of the Second World War, in a collapse so extreme that economists still use it as the textbook definition of total currency death. By the summer of 1946, prices in Hungary were doubling roughly every 15 hours. At its most extreme point, Hungary's penga was losing value so fast that a banknote issued in the morning could be virtually worthless by nightfall. The government eventually had to introduce a new denomination so large it required scientific notation to write clearly on paper money, a number followed by 20 zeros, printed directly onto a banknote, because ordinary numerical formatting couldn't keep pace with the collapse. What's remarkable is how quickly ordinary Hungarians adapted, almost as if a kind of institutional memory of currency collapse gets encoded into a population that lives through it. Farmers stopped selling crops for cash almost entirely, reverting instead to direct barter with neighbors and city dwellers desperate for food. A doctor might be paid in eggs and bacon rather than penga. A skilled tradesman, a carpenter, a mechanic, a tailor, could trade labor directly for goods, sidestepping the collapsing currency completely. The people who suffered the most acutely were the ones with the fewest tangible skills or goods to offer directly, and the most reliance on fixed cash incomes. Pensioners, salaried clerks, anyone whose entire economic existence depended on numbers printed on paper that the government itself no longer controlled the value of. Yugoslavia, the 1990s. A currency collapsing alongside a country. Move forward roughly 50 years, and the same pattern reappears in the former Yugoslavia, this time entangled with the added chaos of a country breaking apart through war. Throughout the early 1990s, the Yugoslav dinar underwent one of the most severe hyperinflations in modern European history, with the government issuing new currency denominations at a dizzying pace, each one instantly threatened with the same fate as the last. What makes this case particularly useful is how clearly it demonstrates the informal financial infrastructure that springs up almost automatically once a population no longer trusts its own currency. The German mark, ironically, the successor to the very currency that had collapsed in 1923, became the de facto parallel currency across much of the former Yugoslavia. Prices for major purchases were frequently quoted and paid in foreign currency, even though officially illegal in many contexts, because both buyer and seller understood the local dinar might lose 10 or 20% of its value before the transaction could even be completed. Savings, when people had any, were kept in mattresses and hidden compartments in foreign banknotes rather than domestic bank accounts, because domestic banks and domestic currency had both proven, repeatedly, that they could not be trusted to hold value reliably. This case adds something the German and Hungarian examples don't emphasize as clearly. Trust, once broken by a currency collapse, doesn't automatically return when a new currency gets introduced. People who lived through the dinar's collapse often remain skeptical of formal banking and domestic currency for years afterward, preferring cash, foreign currency, or tangible goods even once officials insisted the crisis had passed. Zimbabwe, 2008, when the printing press simply never stopped. By the time Zimbabwe's currency finally collapsed completely in 2008, the world had already watched Weimar Germany, Hungary, and Yugoslavia go through nearly identical processes, and yet the mechanism repeated itself with almost eerie precision. Facing land reform disruptions, falling agricultural production, and mounting government debt, Zimbabwe's central bank resorted to printing money at a pace that eventually produced an inflation rate estimated, at its absolute peak, at roughly 89.7 sextillion% annually, a number so large it barely functions as a meaningful statistic anymore. Prices doubled roughly every day. The government issued a $100 trillion banknote, an object that today sells to collectors online for a small fraction of its printed face value, a physical artifact of just how completely a currency can lose all connection to real value. What happened next in Zimbabwe follows the exact same survival pattern as every previous case in this video, compressed into an even shorter time frame. The US dollar and South African rand quickly became the preferred medium of exchange in daily transactions, official currency rules notwithstanding. Farmers, tradespeople, and anyone with a marketable skill or physical good reverted to direct exchange wherever possible. And eventually, the Zimbabwean government simply gave up on its own currency altogether, formally allowing foreign currencies to be used for ordinary transactions, an unusual and humbling admission that a national government had lost the ability to make its own money function as money. The pattern underneath every collapse. Look across Germany, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Zimbabwe. For different centuries' worth of political systems, for different continents' worth of culture and circumstance, and the exact same list of things reliably remains valuable once the paper currency dies. Foreign currency survives because it represents a claim on a different, more stable economic system entirely, one that isn't experiencing the same collapse. Physical, tangible assets survive: land, tools, livestock, stored food, precious metals, because their value doesn't depend on a government's continued ability to manage its own money supply. Direct, marketable skills survive, arguably better than almost anything else, because a skilled trade person can always exchange labor for goods directly, completely bypassing a currency that's failed to hold its value. And social trust and community networks survive, in the specific sense that people with strong local relationships find it far easier to arrange informal barter and mutual assistance than people who are isolated or new to a community when a collapse hits. What consistently fails to survive, in every single one of these cases, is exactly the thing people are conditioned to think of as safe, cash savings, and fixed cash incomes, denominated purely in the collapsing currency, with no tangible backing and no ability to convert quickly into something more durable. Why this keeps catching people by surprise? If this pattern is so consistent across a century of collapses on 4 different continents, why does each new hyperinflation still seem to catch its own population off guard? Because currency collapse doesn't usually announce itself with a single dramatic headline. It typically arrives gradually before it arrives catastrophically, prices rising a little faster than wages for months or years, savings quietly losing purchasing power at a pace slow enough to rationalize, before crossing a threshold where the loss suddenly accelerates into something unmanageable within weeks or days. By the time the wheelbarrows and the sextillion% headlines show up, the actual damage has usually already been building, quietly, for a long time before anyone was willing to call it a crisis. There's also a psychological trap specific to a currency people have used their entire lives. The assumption that the money itself has some kind of inherent, permanent value, rather than being a shared social agreement that can be broken by the same institution that created it. Every one of the collapses in this video happened to populations who, right up until the moment their currency failed, generally trusted it exactly the way most people today trust the currency in their own wallet. What history actually teaches you here. If there's a genuinely useful lesson buried in a century of currency collapses on 4 continents, it isn't distrust all money or hoard gold under your mattress. It's narrower and more broadly applicable than that. First, diversification isn't just an investment principle for stock portfolios. It's exactly what separated the people who came through these collapses relatively intact from the people who didn't. Holding some value outside your home currency, in some form, has been a genuine survival strategy across every single case in this video. Second, tangible skills and tangible goods have outperformed pure cash savings in every currency collapse in recorded economic history. A currency can be printed into worthlessness in months. A useful skill or a stock pantry cannot. Third, and perhaps most importantly, community and trust networks are not a soft, sentimental afterthought to financial survival. They're one of the most consistently documented factors in who successfully navigates a currency collapse and who doesn't. Barter, mutual aid, and informal credit between people who trust each other kept entire populations fed in Weimar Germany, in post-war Hungary, in the former Yugoslavia, and in Zimbabwe, long after the official currency had stopped being able to do that job. The closing truth. Every population in this video woke up one ordinary morning holding money that had worked perfectly well the day before. None of them expected the collapse to happen as fast as it eventually did, and nearly all of them discovered, in real time, exactly the same short list of things that still held value once the paper stopped meaning anything: foreign currency, tangible goods, marketable skills, and the people around them willing to trade in good faith. A currency is, in the end, just a shared story everyone agrees to believe. When enough people stop believing it at the same time, the story ends, sometimes over decades, sometimes over a single terrifying season, and what's left standing afterward has never been the money itself. It's always been everything the money was only ever supposed to represent. History doesn't repeat, but the list of what survives a currency's death has stayed remarkably identical for over a century. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.